Hello and welcome to today's virtual experience from the Kentucky Historical Society. Over the last several weeks, we've explored the buildings and exhibitions on display here in Frankfort. Today, we are again upstairs in our collection storage, examining the Kentucky experience through the Civil War. I'm standing upstairs in our textile collection, looking at a variety of hats, with a couple of really interesting looking Civil War hats performing. Although we are closed to on-site visitors, we offer an array of virtual programs and online services to educate and engage with you through Kentucky history. My name is Greg, and I am your voice today. So be sure to ask lots of questions and let me know you are here. Also responding to your questions and providing more information in the comments section is our Kentucky history advocate, Stuart Sanders. We're so glad that you've joined us today. Our guide today is the program manager for the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition, Chuck Welsko.
Hi everyone, my name is Chuck Welsko. I run the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition. Large name, a long name for a large project here at KHS. We hold on that digital repository over 10,000 documents that are annotated, transcribed, and digitized for you to use for free. We usually call it CWGK to get around the long name. What I'm here to do today is to lead you through kind of a look at some of the objects we have, essentially a special version of our Beyond the Exhibit tour. Now, when we're not in the midst of a global pandemic, we run these tours on Saturday afternoons, giving visitors a sense of what happens behind the scenes, what goes on in our archival collections, and where we are today in our storage collection of KHS. Looking at objects, looking at documents, showing you the things that don't always make it, either for preservation reasons or for space reasons, into our exhibits on our campus. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to walk you through 4 objects that tie into Civil War Kentucky, that run the gamut from the start of the Civil War, from when Kentucky is neutral, divided between pro-slavery Unionists who wish to remain in the Union to defend the institution of slavery through the Constitution, and secessionists who wish to leave the United States and take Kentucky into the Confederacy, all the way through to the end of 1865. The other thing I want to do is I want these objects to serve as launching points for discovery. I've tried to pick objects that tie into things that KHS has, whether it's the Civil War Governors Project, whether it's the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, our journal that's edited by my friend Stephanie Lang, trying to use these objects to start launching you into other discoveries, other things to learn about, ways to continue learning about Kentucky history. So if you have questions, feel free to ask. If Stuart doesn't get to them, Greg can be your voice, as he said, giving your questions to me, and hopefully I'll leave you with some questions and things to think about as we go along.
Allison, we're so glad you've joined us. Yes, it is a fascinating place to work and to be, and we are surrounded by lots of cool stuff.
Yeah. Welcome, Allison. I want to start, though, with one of my favorite quotes from CWGK that speaks to KHS's mission, what I try to do in my daily work. The quote comes from George Howell, a resident of Fulton County, Kentucky, a judge, attorney, and a Civil War soldier. In November of 1863, Howell writes to Kentucky authorities in Frankfort, and he says, quote, "The history of this stupendous rebellion is yet to be written, and to be written in all truthfulness. The future historian must look to the public archive, among which he will find the evidences of outrages committed on both sides." While maybe we won't talk about too many outrages today, we can at least go to the archive and look at some of the artifacts that we have. So let's go to our first one. So the first object I want to talk to you guys about today is this flag right here. This flag was for the 8th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment. It is made by the women of Estill County, or at least one of 2 flags that the 8th Kentucky uses. The flag was donated and given to Captain John Wilson on September 14th, 1861. About 10 days after Kentucky officially joins the Civil War. If you watched the Grant miniseries last night, one of the things it focused on was Confederate troops moving into western Kentucky, the Jackson Purchase, or the South Carolina as Kentucky, as historian Barry Craig calls it.
Was that on KET, Chuck?
That was on History Channel.
History Channel.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Sorry. The flag, though, is given to John Wilson, and the 8th Kentucky Volunteer Infantry makes their way throughout the war, fighting at battles of Perryville, Chickamauga, and eventually Lookout Mountain outside of Chattanooga. Family legend holds that this flag, carried by John Wilson and 5 other members, make it to the top of Lookout Mountain in 1863. Yes, in November of 1863. So we could talk about, right, the military side of this battle. We could talk about the fact that, or of this regiment, that over 200 men of the 8th Kentucky serve and die in the Civil War, 50 through battlefield casualties, another 150 through sickness and illness as they are in camps and moving throughout the Civil War. But we could also talk about the women who make the flag, who forge her creating the flag, presenting it to the soldiers. These flag presentations would happen frequently throughout the Civil War. Turning to the register, the special CWGK issue, there is a poem printed in here that was given at the presentation to the 3rd Kentucky Volunteer Infantry Regiment in early 1861. And I just want to read a little bit of that poem. A couple particular pieces. Written by Corporal William F. Marvin, the poem ends with noting, "While mothers and sweethearts and sisters and sires kindle widely new torches from liberty fires, with Bramlett and Scott and McKee and a host of leaders as brave as the bravest can boast, we will follow our banner with love, with pride, and return it with honor, or die by its side."
Let's take a look at the that cover of that one.
This is the CWGK issue, like I said. 12 articles published by KHS, all built off of research from our CWGK digital documentary edition. The poem, though, right, highlights 2 important sides. One, that the soldiers will go off and they will fight and defend this flag to the death, as many of them do, right? 50 die in battle, another 150 while they're serving. But it also talks about the people who remain at home, right? The women who make the flags, who offer themselves a political voice in a way that maybe they couldn't at the ballot box, but they find a way to engage and represent their loyalty, right, to the Union by expressing this flag. Or other examples, right, at Columbus, Kentucky, early in the Civil War, during the period of neutrality, the city of Altoona, a steamer full of Union troops, is patrolling the Mississippi, trying to catch people smuggling guns into western Kentucky to arm secessionists, to arm the Confederacy, or people who want to pull Kentucky out of the Confederacy. When they drive past Columbus, they see a giant Confederate flag flying over the city, 15 by 7 feet, flying over the city.
That's huge.
Yeah, a giant.
15 by 17 feet. How big is that? Let's see.
Let's see, that's what?
15, that's longer than most cars.
Right.
For sure. I mean, it's really big.
Yeah, a huge giant flag, right, which must have been an insult to these United States soldiers, right, as they're sailing down the river. And they see this giant flag coming, flying above the city. As they come back up the river, they cut down the flag falls, and a woman calls out, "I've got plenty more material where that comes from, and I'll have another flag up before the day is done." The soldiers return to Cairo, Illinois, and not long after that they receive word that another similar flag is flying above Columbus, Kentucky. This flag represents, right, patriotism. It represents the early enthusiasm of soldiers and Kentuckians. 120,000 Kentuckians will fight for the United States during the Civil War. Another 40,000 will fight for the Confederacy. This flag represents that, and it represents the communities, the connection between battlefield and home front. But there's another important story. That's going to lead us to our second object.
Thanks for joining us, Kate, from the UAE.
Leads us to our second object. This object connects to African Americans and the institution of slavery in Kentucky during the Civil War. It is a muster and descriptive roll book for African American troops from the 7th, 8th, and 9th congressional districts of Kentucky. It lists some basic information, right? You see their name, the rank, the unit they would enlist in, where they were from, the county, the state, and some general descriptions about these individuals. It's raw data that historians can use to interpret the lives of these individuals, but it also represents an important narrative. Of those 120,000 Union soldiers I just mentioned, who fight for the United States from Kentucky, about 23,000 of them are African Americans, formerly enslaved men of the 220,000 or so African Americans who are enslaved in Kentucky during the Civil War. They enlist and they fight for their freedom. Now, it's important to note that slavery and emancipation are two important aspects of the Civil War. But if you think of recent works like this book by Amy Taylor, a friend of KHS and a professor at the University of Kentucky, talks about refugee camps like Camp Nelson, and it focuses heavily on Camp Nelson in Kentucky. What begins in Jessamine County as a Union military encampment to protect the Kentucky River, looking over the bluffs of the Kentucky River, and is well suited to protect the southern approaches to Lexington. But over time, as Amy Taylor highlights, and as this book connects to, as African Americans are impressed into the Union Army, they eventually start drawing their families to places like Camp Nelson. As the war goes on and the United States government makes emancipation a tool to punish the Confederacy for the rebellion and to end that strife between the North and the South, African Americans increasingly turn to the Union Army as a means of securing their freedom. It's not even across the nation, but places like Camp Nelson, and the men that are recorded in these record books and other camps throughout the country are where these men go to enlist and serve in the United States Army.
And Chuck, I don't think everybody can understand the scale through the phone here.
Right.
Will you put your hand near the book so that...
I will not touch it and
Right.
practice safe
But I
practice.
want everyone to see the scale of this book and how large it is. And each page is filled with names. These are all people that were signing up there at Camp Nelson.
Yes.
Which is just south of, where is it? Just south of Nicholasville, right?
Yep, it's just south of Nicholasville.
Just a short drive from Lexington if you live there.
Right. If you're in Lexington, hop out. If you're looking for something to do during the quarantine, right? Safely, remember, social distance. I have my mask down so you can actually hear me. Hopefully you can hear me. And drive down to Camp Nelson, check it out. It records a very important story. So we might think of different individuals like Peter Bruner, a man from Irvine, Kentucky, right, who walks over 40 miles in one day to make his way to Camp Nelson and eventually enlist in the 12th Heavy U.S. Artillery. But Camp Nelson is important for another story, as it pushes national considerations. In November of 1864, Speed Fry Smith is in command of Camp Nelson. And like many other Kentuckians, many other white people in Kentucky, he has grown dissatisfied with the policy of the Union government. He ends up pushing out 250 of the African Americans encamped at Camp Nelson, mostly men, women, and children, older individuals who are unable to serve as laborers or soldiers in the Union Army. It's a harsh winter when he pushes them out. They are ill-provisioned, and as a result of those 250 people, after they are brought back to the camp, roughly over 100 of them die from illnesses that they receive. Nationally, this sparks attention to the plight of African Americans, as Amy Taylor points out in her book, at places like Camp Nelson, and it helps secure passage of the 13th Amendment, which ends the institution of slavery in the United States. It's also really important to highlight the fact that the process of emancipation, the arming of African American soldiers, creates friction within Kentucky. It creates increased divisions and animosity, again, between Kentuckians who are divided over how best to preserve their way of life, and who come to see the federal government as increasingly intrusive and oppressive to their rights. If we think of these four objects as building a narrative, right, I've kind of shown you both sides of the different soldiers that are fighting and how they enlist and why they enlist. But it's also building up to a narrative of discontent in Kentucky. And that's going to lead us to our next item. But do we have any questions?
Yeah, but before we get to that next thing, we've got a couple of comments. Patty Vance, who is a regular watcher,
Yes,
with us, noted the penmanship of that time, and you're right, it is absolutely stunning penmanship.
Much better than mine.
Yeah. My guess is that many of the slaves were not the ones to actually write here.
So in these books, right, it would have been a Union officer who would have been filling out this book, or someone at the camp who were filling out these forms. It would not have been the African American enslaved people themselves. We've often come across, right, in CWGK, those 10,000 documents come from ordinary individuals. We've come across enslaved men and women who are petitioning the 5 Civil War governors for a redress of their grievances, whether it's being arrested, getting involved in confrontations, or getting fined for a variety of reasons.
Andrew wants to know, do we have similar books for other units?
Yes, so we do have, actually, in the same drawer that I pulled this one out from earlier today, there is another one for other non-USCT troops. So this is mostly for United States colored troops. There are other ones. The one that was right next to it was for 1861. I imagine we have similar books. Don't quote me on that 100%, but I know there's at least one other book that was right next to this one that connects to other regiments and other soldiers. And in 1866, the state of Kentucky also publishes the Adjutant General's Report, which produces many of the things that look like this, right? The name, the unit the individual enlisted with. I believe they're available online, and they're also available here whenever KHS opens back up if you want to come in and research ancestors or soldiers coming off of Memorial Day, right? If you're interested in looking into the Kentuckians who fought and died in the Civil War. And later, I think it's in the 1880s or 1890s, a Confederate version also comes out, a Confederate Adjutant General's Report.
And if there is a specific topic or document that you want to see, our research staff are available to help. They're working from home, but rotating in and out of the office. And so if you have a specific research request, they'd be willing to help. Call or email. All the information is on our website.
Right. And one of the things our executive director, Scott, always says, right, is although our doors are closed, right, we're not closed. We're still working hard. We're still here doing research. My team for CWGK has not stopped working. Maybe they need a little bit of a break, but they've not stopped working since the quarantine began. Any other questions?
Nope, that's good.
All right. So to move on to our third object, it is a printing from Harper's Weekly titled A Rebel Garade on a Western Town.
Can you explain what Harper's Weekly is real quick?
Sure. Harper's Weekly was one of the first national magazines that is published kind of before and during and after the Civil War that recaptures kind of national news. So most newspapers in the 19th century, especially around the Civil War, are highly partisan local products, right? There are some newspapers like Harper's Weekly, the New York Tribune, that have wide national circulation, but most kind of stay locally to a county or a couple of counties or a city. Harper's Weekly, though, is one of the most popular national print media. This image represents a guerrilla raid on a western town. It is a nondescript western town. We think that it could be, it's possible that it was inspired by places in Kentucky. As you can see the name over here, the Planters Hotel. There is a Planters House in Owensboro, Kentucky, and there's a Planters Hotel in Louisville. So it's possible that this scene served as a setting, or those places may have served as inspiration for Thomas Nash's drawing, this drawing here that's published in September of 1862. Now, the reason I show this is because of the two previous objects I talked about. The patriotism that emerged in early Kentucky, as I said, right, is confronted by the realities of emancipation and also desperation, right? As the war progresses, again, if you continue to watch the miniseries on Grant tonight, right, you'll see as Grant's forces in the United States Army pushes through the Confederacy. In Kentucky, they become increasingly desperate to secure volunteers to fight for the Confederate Army or to cut Union supply lines. And the Confederacy will frequently turn to guerrilla tactics, whether it's John Hunt Morgan's raids that leave soldiers in Kentucky as those raids are pushed back, William Quantrill raiding into western Kentucky, and other Confederate soldiers who live in the state or come back to the state, or secessionists who are opposed to Union occupation. There's a couple things to point out in this painting, or this drawing, sorry. Again, it is a general overview, right, of kind of what a guerrilla raid could have looked like. But you see things like a dog that's been shot and killed. You see a baby being dangled by its foot. A church on fire in the background. A bridge destroyed and a train wrecked. And regular looting and fighting and just general lewdness, right, throughout the scene. Historians...
Not to mention the hanging...
Right, not to mention the hanging guy that's there in the shadows, right? Good eyes, Greg. I think what's important to think about is contemporarily, right, historians have paid more attention to irregular conflicts because of recent events for the United States, right? Over the past 2 decades, mirroring events of unconventional warfare in the Middle East, academics have turned to look at irregular warfare during the Civil War. They've come to look at Kentucky, once kind of viewed as this backwater that didn't really have anything important happen in it, as a central place for guerrilla warfare. We can think of comparing places like Missouri and Kentucky. Some historians have pointed out in Missouri there's a really clear pattern of what happens that sets off guerrilla warfare. There's presence of Union troops, usually some type of emancipatory event, some type of emancipation happens, and then there's some type of guerrilla activity. And this pattern kind of goes very secularly, right? You can kind of predict where guerrilla violence is going to happen. That's not true in Kentucky. Kentucky is unbridled chaos during the Civil War. We can think of an example of a man by the name of James Keller. He lives up in northern Kentucky around Pendleton County, and he becomes not maybe an infamous guerrilla, but he operates behind enemy lines. When one man, Major Abram Wileman, who's wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga, returns home, James Keller hunts him down, breaks into his house, and drags him from his home, takes him out, and executes him. Not long after that, James Keller robs another man. He robs a man by the name of William Watkins. Now, he makes a couple of mistakes here. One, not long after he robs Watkins, he gets caught and arrested. Watkins finds out that Keller has stolen his money, that the man who stole his money is in jail. He goes to collect his money, and in the process brings a gun and kills Keller while he's in his jail cell. Referring back right to how, let's quote earlier, outrage is committed by people on both sides. It's important to note that Thomas Bramlett, then governor in 1863 of Kentucky, actually writes on behalf of William Watkins. And he notes when Watkins has been fined for selling liquor without a license or running a tippling house in 19th century terms, that, quote, Watkins has served his country well, has suffered for his loyalty greatly, has recently been plundered and robbed, and has done the county the good service of killing James Keller, the murderer of Major Wileman, and his own plunderer. I therefore order remission of the fine except fees and costs. Didn't really matter who you killed as long as you killed a rebel, right? That's kind of Bramlett's philosophy, at least at that point in the war, as irregular warfare is tearing Kentucky apart. He hires men like Edwin Tyrrell, the famous guerrilla hunter, to lead expeditions to take down partisans or Confederate guerrillas who are operating in the state. Tyrrell doesn't have a stellar reputation, as he has a tendency to shoot people in the back. So again, there are outrages committed on both sides, and Kentucky is by no means a peaceful place. And this builds off of the narrative I've been trying to tell you, right? Starting from the early enthusiasm with the flag, to the enlistment of African American soldiers, and the erosion of slavery in the state, to the chaos of guerrilla warfare. So where does this leave us?
So before you get to that last question, before you get to that last artifact, I want to remind our guests that you're welcome to ask questions, and we've got one more artifact to look at and a little bit more to talk about. But if you have specific questions, post them now so that we can answer them before we get off air.
Right, and you can also email me. You can find my email on KHS's website. It's my first name, charles.welsko@k.ky.gov. Feel free to shoot me emails after this. I'd be happy to respond to those. Keep this conversation going, or at least this one side of me talking to you while you're listening going. All of this builds up, though. All of these artifacts, all of the stories I've been telling you in this quick, right? We have like 7,000 objects that connect to the Civil War, and I'm showing you 4 of them trying to tell a diverse and inclusive story. It builds up to the memory of how Kentuckians recollect and shape their identity after the Civil War. Anne Marshall has written a fantastic book that talks about creating a Confederate Kentucky. After the Civil War, Kentuckians create this memory of being more of a Southern, more of a Confederate state. And we can see that very specifically in the papers of George Washington Johnson, the first provisional Confederate governor of the state. He is from Georgetown, Kentucky. He is a lawyer, attorney, member of the House of Representatives for a couple of years in Kentucky, and eventually the first provisional Confederate governor, helping establish a Confederate government in Kentucky at the Russellville Convention in November of 1861, and leading the government for the first few months that Kentucky is in the Civil War. Now, as Union forces move and occupy Kentucky, they force Johnson and the Confederate government of Kentucky out of the state. This is a letter written in January of 1862 to his wife, and while Johnson is forced away, right, he retreats south through Tennessee, following John C. Breckinridge, Kentucky's 1860 presidential candidate, and a Confederate Army officer during the Civil War. As Johnson leaves, he is eventually following Breckinridge's command, and they retreat to the battle. They retreat to Tennessee and Alabama. Johnson will enlist in the 4th Kentucky Infantry for the Confederacy and fight at the Battle of Shiloh as a private. Right, he goes from governor to private, quite a demotion, I guess, to some degree. But he is also expressing his patriotism and his willingness to fight for the Confederacy. And I can flip a page over so you can continue to see one of these letters and what is actually Johnson's fairly decent penmanship. Johnson is mortally wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. He dies not long after the battle ends and becomes a martyr for secessionists and Confederates in Kentucky. The reason I bring up Johnson's papers is because his image is used, or his memory is used frequently in Kentucky. The Scotts County Library is named after, or partially named after, George Johnson, and also at places like the Kentucky Historical Society and the Filson Club and other places throughout Kentucky following the Civil War. There is an intentional creation of a Confederate memory. And if you look, I'm going to turn the box over just so you can see. This is MSS1. This is manuscript collection number 1. The first archived collection in KHS's repository doesn't have anything to do with Daniel Boone, doesn't have anything to do with George Rogers Clark. It is the first provisional Confederate governor. There is an intentional creation of through the dissatisfaction, right, with the enlistment of African Americans and the destruction of slavery, there is this creation of a Confederate identity after the Civil War by Kentuckians, this idea that they were actually the 12th state in the Confederacy. We might look at this in December of 1865, Thomas Bramlett, right, the man who excused William Watkins for killing the rebel James Keller, notes in December of 1865, if I can find the quote, he gives a speech to the General Assembly, and he notes that after the 13th Amendment has been passed, destroying the institution of slavery forever, that freedom is national. Right? There's nothing that can be done about slavery now. But he'll add, a few lines later, this important line. However, quote, franchises other than freedom are political, not natural, and are left to the states respectively to regulate each for itself. Bramlett will be instrumental in creating a Confederate Kentucky, in denying rights to African Americans recently freed from the institution of slavery. And this is important to mention because that brings us to today and projects like CWGK and the mission of KHS today. As I tried to do with this tour, I tried to tell the story of all Kentuckians during the Civil War and the memories that they created afterwards. Perhaps in a trying time as we're facing social uncertainty, we can look back at one of the most uncertain events in American history that was deeply divisive in the state of Kentucky, and think of questions. How did the meaning of freedom change during the Civil War in Kentucky? How did Kentuckians shape their memories? How does the divisions of the wartime period translate into a post-war period? Where can you go to continue finding these answers and these questions? That's an easy answer. You can keep coming to KHS. Eventually our doors will reopen and you can come back in and you can look at the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. We've got, this is a special issue on guerrilla warfare. You can look at CWGK and its digital resources. The enrollment book that I showed you earlier, that is digitized online. We have diaries like that of Ellen Wallace and other people during the Civil War that have been digitized, or you can come in and read them while we're here. We're still available to answer questions, to engage, to provide you opportunities to keep learning. And I hope I've said things that have inspired you to learn, either because you agree with me, you want to find out more, or even if you disagree with my interpretation. That's what history is. It's about asking questions and learning more. I hope you enjoyed my talk, and if there are any other questions, I think we've got some time, and I'd be happy to tackle some of those questions for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things. Right now, for a limited time, our register is online and free to read through Project Muse. We'll share a link for that of where you can find those. But we do have a couple of questions.
Certainly.
I'll ask one of the most recent ones first, just because it relates to what you were just talking about. Does Johnson's home still stand in Scott County? Do you know?
Oh, man, that's a good question. I'm not 100% sure. Stuart, can you bail me out in the comments section?
Yeah, we'll ask Stuart if he knows if the Johnson house still stands in Scott County. Kate asked, why do you think Kentucky was this sort of unbridled zone, this term that you used? Was it politics? Was it geography or culture?
So different historians will say different things. I think it's a little bit of column A, column B, right? That I'm kind of hedging my bets there a little bit, but I think part of it, right, Barry Craig talks about the Jackson Purchase, as I said earlier, right, as the South Carolina of Kentucky, in large part because of geography, right? It is separated by rivers from the rest of Kentucky, and it's more aligned in its position on the Mississippi with Tennessee and places further south. But I also think it's cultural, right? Cultural and economic. The ties of places like Louisville and Lexington to the Ohio River and places across in Ohio and Illinois, right? There are these pulls that pull Kentuckians, and we see this in other places, right? In West Virginia, where I did my PhD, right? There's these pulls between the northern parts of these border states, socially and economically, into the regions north of them, so into northern economies and northern immigrant communities that are moving in. So I think it's a little bit of that, and I think it's these fundamental differences looking at the question of how is best to save the institutions of Kentucky. So I tried to answer that with a little bit of everything. So the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Yeah, a little bit of all of that unbridledness going on here. We've got lots of folks saying thank you, and we just want to say thank you all too. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you joined us or joined us a little late, I'll review real quick. We looked at several different artifacts relating to the Civil War and the experiences of many different people living in Kentucky during that time period. Feel free to go back and view. As soon as the tour is over, we'll make it available for you all to watch again. Our next tour is this Thursday with our curator, Julie Kemper. And we have new virtual programs coming soon in June, so look for those details coming soon. Make sure you follow us on all of our social media and consider becoming a member of the Kentucky Historical Society. And to support help programming just like this, visit our website, history.ky.gov/virtual visitor to learn more.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe and healthy at home, and go Team Kentucky. You're welcome, Kate.